and welcome to Smarter, Richer, Braver, the podcast that's specially curated for you, a generation of young people who want to step up, stand out, and live life on their own terms. A generation who aim to do better, not just for themselves, but for humanity as a whole. A generation who aim to be smarter, richer, and braver, because that's exactly what the world today needs. I'm your host, Marilyn Pinto, author and founder at KFI Global, and I'd like to warmly welcome all you Gen Zers. A special shout out to all our KFI Global students listening in. Please know that this podcast was made with you in mind, and I promise it's going to be worth your attention.
This podcast is strictly for those 25 years and younger. If you are older than that, please listen at your own risk. Common side effects include regret and anger for not having heard this earlier in your life.
Today's episode is focused on something that's extremely relevant to all of you. You're all going to have to do this sooner or later. It's complicated, and most of you haven't been properly equipped for this. And what's scary is that no one really knows how to do this until they've gone through it. Today, we're talking about becoming adults. Not just legally, but what this means in terms of responsibility and independence and self-sufficiency. Our guest today is Dr. Mark McConville, a clinical psychologist specializing in adolescent, emerging adult, and family psychology. He's got very interesting insights into the challenges most young people like you face on your journey to adulthood, how to overcome them, and what to do to thrive in the skill of adulting. This episode is as enlightening as it is empowering and will help you lead a life that's smarter, richer, and braver. Welcome to the podcast, Mark, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
And thanks so much for the invitation.
Mark, why do you do what you do? Someone that works with young people specifically.
So I think there are two ways I could answer it. What I think of as the climbing wall as an image of growing up. You take steps and then opportunities present themselves. And that's what happened for me. I took a job right out of graduate school, and the job involved a lot of public speaking, which at the time I dreaded. And then a position opened up in the adolescent and child psychology division. And so I found myself working with young people, with adolescents. I liked it. And then somewhere around the 2000s, when we began to see more and more people in their early and mid-20s who were struggling with growing up, and who to refer those people to. And being an adolescent therapist, I think I was a natural for that. So part of why I do what I do is just serendipity. It fell into my lap. But the other way I have looked at it sometimes is in retrospect, when you stop and look back on your career and you say, what was the underlying purpose? What was the meaning of it? And the best I've come up with is that I've spent my career trying to become the adult that was missing for me in my own years of growing up.
Yeah, that's very true. And what, according to you, are the biggest misconceptions that young people have about adulthood?
Of course, you don't understand adulthood until you get there, but I think young people have misconceptions about how one gets there. And so they often accept the chronology of adulthood. But of course, there are so many things that you don't know what you're doing at that age. It's very interesting, the research of Jeffrey Arnett, who's the leading authority on emerging adulthood. And he has given questionnaires to tens of thousands of young people. And one of the questions he puts to them is, do you feel like an adult? And then he gives them 5 choices: hardly at all, a little bit, half of the time, much of the time, most of the time. And the interesting statistic is that it's not until age 26 and a half years old that half of the people report feeling like an adult half of the time. And when I look back on that, on my own life, I think, whoa, that's just about right.
Yeah, I was just going to say, that's actually just about right.
And so every one of those young people thinks, it's just me. I don't feel like a grown-up, but the world expects me to be. I expect myself to be. And so they feel in some way that they're falling short or they're inadequate. So that's the greatest misconception. The other one is so often entry-level jobs into the adult work market are not very glamorous. They're lousy jobs in many ways.
Yeah.
And young people will often think if I take this job, I'm locking into doing this for the rest of my life, not realizing that it's all stepping stones, that each job opens up an option, a new window that hadn't been there before.
That's really helpful. Speaking of Dr. Jeffrey Arnett, according to him, he says there are three widely agreed upon criteria for becoming an adult. The first one is to accept responsibility for yourself. The second, to make independent life decisions. And the third is to become financially independent. Could you explain what each of these mean?
Well, those criteria actually came from these questionnaires that he gave to so many young people. And what he did is he generated a long list of traits and he asked the young people themselves to rate them. What do you think are the primary criteria of being an adult? And those three came out on top of the list. And when I looked at them and I asked myself the question you're asking me, what do they mean? To me, they were really three versions of the same thing, which I think of as the existential psychologist Irvin Yalom uses the concept of responsibility to mean ownership. I'm taking ownership of my life, which means it's time for me to make these important choices, for me to make these decisions, for me to chart my course, which means taking on financial responsibility and eventually independence. So to me, it all comes down to that sense of this is
Ownership?
my life. I own it and I need to run it.
Okay. And in your book, Failure to Launch, you talk about three main challenges of transitioning to adulthood: becoming responsible, becoming relational, and becoming relevant. Could you briefly explain each challenge to our young listeners and maybe a few pointers on how they can address each one?
So, first, let me tell you how I arrived at this because I did not set out to write this book. I'm a private practice office practitioner. And for my entire career, I have kept journals about my work where I would try to identify problems, try to solve problems, try to learn from my clients. And what I began to notice is that most of my psychotherapy work with young adults seemed to center around certain themes that were reiterative. They showed up over and over again. And that's how I arrived at these, what I call developmental tasks. Every developmental stage has developmental tasks. So the tasks between 18 and 25 are, first of all, developing responsibility in the sense that I just mentioned,
Taking ownership.
taking ownership. And the thing is that it shows up in very mundane ways. It's ownership of the nitty gritty nuts and bolts of managing a life, renewing my driver's license, paying my income taxes on time, going to the registrar at the college to maybe change a class, paying a parking ticket, things that are not at all glamorous, except that when you're a kid, adults take care of those things for you. The time comes when you have to begin taking care of them yourself. And surprisingly, it's often intimidating for young people. I had a kid who refused to take the bus. He had to take a bus to get to his job. He refused to take the bus, adamantly refused. And I sat down, I looked him in the eye, and I said, "You don't know how to take a bus, do you?" That's right, I don't know. And you don't want to look stupid. That's right, I don't want to look stupid. It sounds silly, but I run into that sort of thing over and over again.
No, that makes sense. Yeah. So that's the part of becoming responsible.
Yeah. In terms of advice to young people, it's have courage. Understand that when you don't know how to do something, it's because you've never done it before. There are many things that are simple to do once you've done them once. But when you haven't done them, they're incomprehensible, they're mysterious, and you just have to plow through it. And actually, the remedy has to do with the second developmental task. It's about reworking your relationships. You need to begin to go out and seek that guidance. And it means finding people who know more than you do. It might be a professor or a teaching assistant, but it's finding people that know more. These are mentorships, and some of them are just momentary, and some of them are lifelong. So it's making connections that are not about the social world of being young. They're really about seeking out, of your own initiative, guidance from people that know more than you do.
I know you alluded to this before, but you talk about the word pre-competence. Could you, for the sake of our audience, explain what this is and how understanding this concept can help them on their journey to adulthood?
Yes, I made that up, by the way. The word that is most commonly used is incompetence. And incompetence is very pejorative. If I'm incompetent, it implies I don't have the talent, the ability, the wherewithal to do something. And so young people often feel incompetent when in fact it's simply that they haven't done this particular thing. So to me, a much more accurate designation is to say you're pre-competent. You haven't yet achieved competence because you haven't done it. So I'm really trying to encourage people to not be so judging and shaming of themselves simply because they don't know what the step is to do something.
That's such
Does
a
that
fantastic way of framing that. Yes. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the transition from high school to college, right? This is a pretty major one for many reasons. Chief among them being that professors expect more from you in terms of self direction and self management. What can these youngsters do to make this transition easier on themselves?
Well, there are probably two areas that I think where I really see, when I see growth, it involves one of two things. One is what psychologists have come to call executive function. It refers to that part of the mind or the part of me that makes plans, that sets objectives, that looks at a syllabus at the beginning of a semester and reads the syllabus and begins to make a plan about how I'm going to address certain requirements of the course. I remember when I started college and I would look at a syllabus and I would immediately have a wave of anxiety. I would just feel overwhelmed and I would close it. I would literally not read it because as soon as I closed it, I felt better. And I would say I had fairly underdeveloped executive function. And I had the remarkable good fortune of meeting a young woman, also a first year college student, who is now my wife. Well, she was loaded with executive function. And we would be maybe having dinner together, and she'd say, well, I have to go back and study. And I'd say, study what? She'd begin to tell me the steps that she was going to go through to prepare for a quiz that was 3 or 4 days away or a test that wasn't until next week. And then I began to mimic or model her that I could plan. I could set out a timetable for things. Some students go into college the way my wife did, with those skills already well developed. Some students, like myself, go into college with plenty of ability, plenty of talent, but they haven't really learned to be a good executive in terms of marshaling and organizing and focusing their resources. The second thing is what I've already talked about, which is looking for support from others that know more than you do. Going to a professor and saying, listen, I'm really having trouble with this set of problems. What can I do that will help me to understand them better? So again, the answer in a nutshell, and you said it, is initiative. So the initiative kind of comes to you. But once you pass high school, the initiative has to come from you. I think that's the best answer I can give.
Yeah, I know that's a fantastic way of looking at it as well.
This podcast isn't meant to entertain you. It's meant to help you do life better by showing you how to think about and navigate important issues that aren't usually talked about to youngsters. But we believe that you need to hear this because it has the potential to change your life and the lives of other young people like you. So please share this episode with someone you care about, and if you haven't already, please hit the follow button. It helps us get these meaningful insights and messages in front of more youngsters.
What do you think are some of the most common traits or beliefs of young people struggling with the transition to adulthood?
I think it's, again, something I touched on before, this misunderstanding of where they're supposed to be in that process. I think it's these unrealistic expectations that they will know what it is they're supposed to be doing, when in fact it goes with the territory that they're not. There's a philosopher at the University of Chicago, Agnes Callard, and she wrote a magnificent book called Aspiration. And what she addresses is the whole phenomenon of trying to become something that I am not yet. It's aspiring to be something that I have not yet accomplished. And the statement she makes that's mind-blowing to me is that intrinsic to the nature of aspiration is the imposter syndrome. The imposter syndrome, the who am I kidding? That I'm sitting here playing the guitar and I barely know what I'm doing. I'm pretending to be a musician. If I get found out, I will be so ashamed. And so people will often back away from things because They feel foolish. And what I love that Collard says is if you wish to become anything new, you just have to tolerate that feeling. When I think of the misconception, it's thinking because I feel like an imposter, because I don't really know what I'm doing, I am somehow singular in that, not realizing that goes with the territory of transitioning from adolescence to adulthood. You have to be a fake adult before you can be a real adult. And if I had to say the hallmark for me of when I really began to feel confidence as an adult, it's not when I knew the whole playbook, not at all. It's when I stopped being ashamed about what I didn't know. I'm not a great practical problem solver. So to me, that was part of the definition of adulthood, is getting over that shame of being imperfect, of not being finished, not being complete.
I want to shift gears a little and talk about the parenting that you speak about. You talk about how parenting should progress from supervision to negotiation and then to consultation. I think this is fascinating. Could you please elaborate?
That's a model that I came up with some years ago. I labeled it the natural history of parenting. And what I did, I asked a very simple question. How do parents influence their children? The parent is in charge, and it's the parent's responsibility. If that child shows up the next day at school, overtired, unwashed, poorly clothed, nobody looks at the 7-year-old and says, this kid is a problem. They think, what are these parents doing? How are they neglecting? So that's the first way, is the parent just supervises. They step in and they take charge. The second way is parents negotiate. And they do it, by the way, with kids of all ages. It's a quid pro quo. I'm willing to give you something if you'll give me something. The third way that parents influence children is what I've come to call consultation. I have advice for you, but I'm conceding that you will be the decision maker. The consultant has lots to say, but has no power, zero power. I am here at your bidding. My real insight is that if you track these three modes of influencing children over the course of the developmental span, there's an evolution. So the primary way of influencing young children is to supervise them, right? You must be the supervisor. As kids move into adolescence, what happens is, as a parent, you begin to realize that supervision has its limits. You don't oversee them. They begin to have a social life of their own. Negotiation is the cardinal skill for getting kids through adolescence. Because what negotiation teaches children is that when you make a deal, and so negotiation is what teaches me to make and to keep my commitments. Now, younger teenagers often make the commitments and don't keep them, right? But that's a process of learning.
So the negotiation phase starts at adolescence, like 12, and goes up to 18.
Well, I would say that's when it is the primary mode. When I run into a family with a 15 or 16-year-old, and they rely almost exclusively on supervision, either an overly obedient child, which is not a good sign, or I'll find an overly rebellious child, which is also not a good sign. But the same is true if I find a family with a 15 or 16-year-old and they rely almost exclusively on consultation. Now what we're basically is asking the child to raise him or herself. Some kids can do it, many cannot. And that's really the bargaining position of parents of teenagers. If you can supervise yourself in a competent way, then I can step back from my role as supervisor. They should be making their own decisions. You can't supervise people at that age. You consult. You say, listen, this is my position on this, but I'm going to respect that you're the decision maker. And that's what consultation is. I have opinions, I have advice, but I'm going to concede from the beginning.
And that leads nicely into the next question. There is a section in your book where you talk about horizontalizing the relationship with mom and dad, which you say is developmentally imperative that young people achieve. Could you delve deeper into this, please?
Yeah, it's just what we've been talking about.
Okay.
But it's maybe talking about it from the kid's point of view.
Yes.
There's a transformation in your relationship with your parents. One aspect of that is what Robert Kagan, the Harvard developmentalist, calls mutuality, meaning I begin to see my parent as a person. They're not just an authority figure. They're not just a provider. They're not just an obstacle to my freedom. But I begin to see that my parent is a person like me. They have feelings, they have strengths, they have weaknesses. But also, I begin to see The relationship is one where I can speak to my parents, at least upon occasion, as an equal. I have an opinion of my own, and that may differ from my parents, and I speak with an independent voice. Child begins to relate to the parent, not so much as a child, but as an adult relating to another adult. You have your own career path, you have your own relationship. But on the way there, you want to move in that direction so that the relationship begins to feel more and more like it's
Balanced.
approaching balanced. Yes. Yeah.
There are a few terms in your book that I loved, and I think our listeners would hugely benefit from understanding them. I'd like you to explain these, how it relates to them, and what you suggest they do. Okay. So the first one is purposeful obliviousness.
It's putting your head in the sand. It's when I'm confronted, and this is something young people who feel anxious and overwhelmed in the face of these nitty gritty responsibilities, these mundane tasks of managing their life, they just don't feel up to. They feel confused and overwhelmed by them. So they rather, not quite consciously, but nonetheless intentionally, block them out of their mind. I think of a young man who had accumulated a series of speeding tickets. And what he did was simply ignore them. And the mother ended up going down to the court and making up a complete fabricated story about him being home deathly sick and ill, and she was there to pay the fines. But he was using obliviousness as a kind of defense against having to deal with the real world because the real world felt too intimidating and too threatening to him. And that one belongs to parents. It's playing the scenario out to the worst possible outcome. In his case, this was a kid who had not gone off to college initially. And then after a year decided, I am going to do college. And to get to college, he had to drive from her neighborhood to a university that was about 30 miles away. So he would drive back and forth, and he's going to lose his license. When he loses his license, he can't drive and go to college. When he can't drive and go to college, he will drop out of college. When he drops out of college, he will go back to what he was doing before. And she just saw him ruining his life if she didn't do this. And that's what parents do. It's an aberrant form of love, right? I love my child so desperately that I want to prevent this extreme outcome that may in fact be quite unlikely. Catastrophizing is a very anxious state of mind that good parents go there.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see how easy it is to go there, actually. Okay, which brings us to our last term, senior year collapse. What is this?
Senior year collapse is something I see it more often in high school, but occasionally in college. And it's that you move from 9th grade to 10th grade to 11th grade, and you get to 12th grade, and there's the end of the moving walkway. There's this sense of, I'm not ready for what comes next. I'm comfortable being a high school student. I've often seen this with kids who are really quite competent students, but they felt in no way ready to make the transition to college. And so senior year comes along, often second semester, and this kid all of a sudden is getting a failing grade in some relatively easy course, not doing any coursework, and it threatens to prevent his graduation. And it's as if there's an unconscious plot to sabotage the whole business of graduating, because as soon as I graduate, there will be a new set of expectations that I move forward and become more adult, but I'm not ready. So it's like throwing on the emergency brake in an effort to stop time in its tracks. And I refer to that as senior year collapse. We sometimes see it in college. You just don't take that last or 9 credits and your parents nag you to complete your degree. But basically what you're saying is, once I complete my, more will be expected of me, and I'm not ready.
Yeah. Okay. I love the letter at the end of your book where you write to the 20-somethings. It's something I wish I had read when I was 20-something. You're so right when you say that becoming an adult is harder than most of us want to acknowledge, and nobody knows how to do it until they've already gone through it. What advice do you have for our listeners as they navigate their way to adulthood?
Well, it's the things that I've already said. It's like reaching out for support, having companions. First of all, your peers, even the ones that look so confident, they are often having many of the same questions, misgivings, and uncertainties. And you feel much better when you know you're not alone, you're not isolated, that you're not the only one that feels, in heavy quotes, stupid about whatever the next challenge is. And certainly reaching out to people that know more about the path than you do. Another piece of research that Jeffrey Arnett did that I just love is he went to people who were in their 40s and 50s, and he gave a questionnaire. And the questionnaire had one particular item he was interested in. And the item was this: I love what I do for a living. I cannot imagine doing anything else. True or false? And in his sample, 17% of people marked true. What he did is he pulled those people out and he interviewed them. He did life history interviews. Tell me about your past. Tell me about your history. Tell me about the choices, about the things you did, the things you didn't do, your educational history. And what he found was the center of the bell curve for when people found that particular career path that seemed to them now 25, 30 years later so perfect was right around age 30. That most people who found that path were between the ages of 28 and 32. So I say to young people, have faith. You'll find your way as you go. Keep moving forward. Your task as a young person is not to know where you're going to end up. It's much more fundamental. This is especially for college students. You need to learn two things. What do you like? What appeals to you? And what are you good at? Those are very reasonable and answerable questions in the course of a college career. And answering those questions will lead you to what is my life's work, my career path going to be.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for doing this, Mark. Thank you for being on the podcast and for all the valuable insights that you've given us. I'm sure these kids are going to have so much to take back from this. Thank you for doing this.
Well, thank you. It's been a real honor just to be invited.
Thank you for listening. I want to help you use what you learned here. And the best way to do that is to get a podcast buddy. That's someone who also listens to this podcast. Then talk to your podcast buddy about the one takeaway from this episode that resonated with you the most. That's it. That's all you have to do. Remember that much of what is talked about on this podcast is stuff that's not typically talked about to young people, and it should be. It's stuff that you need to know so that you can lead a life that's, you guessed it, smarter, richer, and braver. This is your host, Marilyn Pinto, signing off. Until next time.
If you have any questions or topics you'd like us to broach in our upcoming episodes, please email us at smarterricherbraver@gmail.com. And if you'd like to sign up for one of our award-winning programs, go to kfi.global and check out our upcoming schedule.